autonomous University of Lisbon, which is your and mine university. The idea of all the four seminars is the same, is the interreligious dialogue in counteracting violent extremism in Africa, and what to do, how to do, what's happening. And we decided to discuss this in front of specific cases. And in each specific cases, we always invited, us and CAICID, we always invited somebody to be present with us, coming from the country and being an academic activist in this kind of dialogue and knowing exactly what's going on there and what are the problems. So for this one, we have the following panelists. With me, his name is Boris Modest Yakubu. He is a CAICID field expert for the Central African Republic. He is a doctor of science, of philosophy, and a research professor at University of Bangui, the capital of the Central African Republic. He contributed to the creation of the Central African Republic platform of religious confessions. Since 2009, he is a member of the Peace Resources Group and also works as a consultant in social cohesion, reconciliation programs, and interfaith dialogue in the Central African sub-region. This is a resume. Of course, Tim Glavian, that is with us online, thank you for being with us, is an interim professor of political science at University of Freiburg, where he completed his PhD, and a senior researcher at the Arnold Bergstrasser Institute. I don't know where I am pronouncing it correctly. Is a political analyst and a field researcher focusing on issues of local security within fragile states. He has investigated conflict and peace in the Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is another hotspot in Africa. they are, you are competing in this, well, not very good thing. In Egypt, in Kenya, in Haiti, in South Sudan, and in Somalia, mostly in Somaliland, within Somalia. Myself, you know me, but anyway, I am the executive director of the Club of Lisbon, and I'm an invited full professor in international relations at the Autonomous Lisbon University. And I am initiating and I will moderate this seminar. As you, well, my field of expertise, well, I'm an economist, actually. I'm an economist that do not like economy. I prefer international relations. That's why I'm here. Well, I like economy, but anyway. And with me also in the table, it's Agustin Núñez Vicandi. As you know, in Spanish, first comes the surname of the father and then the surname of the mother. So Fernando Agustin Núñez, senior program manager for the Africa program at the International Dialogue Center in CAICID. Is an MA in human rights, well, he's a lot of other things, all of us, at University College of London. University College London, it is not off. And he will make the final remarks and he will close the session. And within the session, he offered, and just to give some support when needed, from French to English to Portuguese to Spanish, etc. Well, thank you very much to all of us. We have also with us another member of CAICID who is there, and a colleague of of mine at the Club of Lisbon, and she's also a journalist, Cristina Pérez. She's sitting there. And she uses to do what we call the Lisbon Club sessions on African issues that are streamed. I would say every 15 days. We will see this year. Anyway, let's begin. I will give the word first to Boris Yakubu, and after that, I will ask Tim Glavian to intervene, and then we will open the debate for questions and answers from the audience and amongst us also. So, good morning to all. Boris, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to give me the opportunity to speak about Central African Republic. Thank you for your invitation. Thank you, Casey. I'm Boris Modeste Yakubu. Est-ce qu'on peut passer le
Tim Glavian.
C'est bon.
É melhor usar esta coisa. Ok.
Okay. Okay, I'm Boris Modeste Yakubu. I'm teacher at the University of Bangui, KIC field expert for Central African Republic. I want to speak about the instrumentalization of religion to justify violence in Africa and how to effectively counter extremist discourses that incite violence. About the summary, we have an introduction and two parts. The first part concerns the instrumentalization of religion. And for understand this, we have in A, the 2030 crisis in the car and its consequence. B, the war of religions argument, extremism groups and using religion to justify violence. We have here four parts: the Seleka phenomenon, the birth of the anti-Balaka, PK5 self-defense groups, and a misconception of religion and a misinterpretation of biblical or Quranic verses. For the two parts, we speak about strategy to counter extremist discourses. In A, it is about the state level, and in B, at the religious level. Central African Republic is 623,000 kilometers and approximately 5 million inhabitants. Central African Republic is located between 6 states: Chad, Cameroon, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Republic of Congo, and the two Sudans, North Sudan and South Sudan. The Central African Republic lies at the junction of two regions and two populations. To the north, the Sahel and the predominantly Muslim pastoralist and trading populations. To the south, the predominantly Christian savannah population. Beyond an apparent clash between religions, the crisis that has shaken the country is primarily political and has its deep roots in the country's management system and government. The Central African crisis, which led to the collapse of the state, has its causes of several levels. We are talking about the crisis of state in its administration, the security crisis, the inter-community crisis, the humanitarian crisis, the socio-economic crisis. Part one, the instrumentalization of religion. A, the political power of Seleka. Seleka is an armed group created in 2012. Seleka means alliance in the vernacular language. This group includes the Union of Democratic Force for Unity, the Convention of Patriots for Justice and Peace, the Central African People's Democratic Front, the Patriotic Convention for the Salvation of Kodro, the Movement for Renaissance and Refundation, alternative political movement in the CAR. The particularity of this armed group is all of its leaders are Muslim, as are the majority of its fighters. In March 2013, the Seleka took political power. The consequences of this political power of the Seleka, only 1 year after taking power, political management was catastrophic. The collapse of the economic system, the fragmentation of the social fabric, inter-community tensions, mistrust and corruption are all factors that make the country a very fragile state. The war of religions, argument, extremist group, and using of religion to justify justice. We want here speak about the Seleka phenomenon. Excuse me. When the Seleka rebels seized political power in March 2013, most of the leaders are fighters openly demonstrated their affiliation with the Muslim faith. They continue to use all kinds of violence against non-Muslims. It should be noted that the two major religions in the Central African Republic are Christianity and Islam. The majority of those who sought refuge in the displaced person camp were non-Muslim, that is, Christian. Some neighborhoods are emptied for the inhabitants, and the only people left in this neighborhood who feared nothing were Muslim. As a result, a divide was created and accentuated between Christian and Muslim. Another phenomenon that the collective consciousness to consider the war of religion that is between Christian and Muslim was the destruction of churches. Since the exception in the north of the country, during the march on the capital to seize power, the Seleka rebel groups looted and destroyed churches and temples. Mosques were not affected. There were even Catholic priests and Protestant pastors who were murdered by the rebel groups. This violence against people and places of worship led the collective opinion to speak of a war of religion. The birth of the anti-Balaka. Created in 2013, the anti-Balaka were initially a self-defense group whose primary objective was to defend their family, property, and life against the Seleka rebels. Indeed, faced with the violence inflicted by the Seleka rebels on non-Muslim subjects, and considering the fact that it was only churches and temples that were being destroyed, the anti-Balaka struggle took on another objective, the defense of Christian subjects. From then on, the anti-Balaka considered themselves Christian. They were not only fighting the Seleka rebels, but all Muslim subjects, with those who had nothing to do with the Seleka's political power. So, for the anti-Balaka and a large part of the population, violence against Muslim subjects has become legitimate. The war of religion was justified. There is also PK5 self-defense groups. In 2014, faced with desperate and violent fighting across the country between the Seleka and the anti-Balaka, and the near inexistence of the state, the international community responding by convening a major meeting of political and civil society actors in Brazzaville for July 21 and 23. At the end of this forum, the Seleka's political power was forcing to resign. After the resignation, the Seleka withdrew with their weapons to the north of the country, where they would establish their authority, even demanding the separation of the country. Fearing for their life and safety, most Muslim citizens were also forced to leave the capital to follow the Seleka or go into exile. The UNHCR even organized a mass departure of Muslims from the capital to join the Seleka occupied areas. Those who remain in Bangui suffer violence from the anti-Balaka, forcing them to retreat to the PK5 neighborhood of Bangui. This is how self-defense groups, Muslim, extremist, emergent rising PK5. The self-defense group created since 2015 in PK5, a predominantly Muslim economic district, has the primary objective of protecting Muslims from anti-Balaka attacks. Indeed, the last stronghold for Muslims in the capital Bangui was PK5. It was there that they were safe, where they could freely and visibly express their Muslim identity. Like the anti-Balaka initially created to defend property and people. The initial intention behind the creation of the self-defense group in PK5 was to protect Muslims from anti-Balaka violence. For them, it was a legitimate defense in the name of Muslim and for Muslim. The majority of Muslim subjects in the PK5 supported the self-defense groups, paying them daily tax to maintain their livelihood and remain under their protection. In the name of religion, young Muslims in the self-defense group fought against Christian extremists to protect their religion, their people, and their property, their religious identity, and their religious freedom throughout ritual and peace and practice. Unfortunately, these groups, like the anti-Balaka, would later be co-opted, manipulated, and used for political gain. But beyond these three phenomena, we can note a fourth example of the instrumentalization of religion. I want to speak about misconception of religion and a misinterpretation of biblical or Quranic verses. This involves a subjective, close-minded reading of religion text to legitimize, motivate, and encourage the legitimacy of violence. This often results from injustice of discrimination against certain followers or from religious identity itself. For the two parts, I want to speak about the strategies to counter extremist discourses. At the state level, I speak about a good governance. Radical and extremist groups are often the result of frustrations, failure to consider the interest of certain individuals of groups or people who feel wronged or rejected by those in power. To avoid this situation, political authorities must develop good governance and sound management of public affairs. The fight for the role of law and strict enforcement of retributive and attributive justice. Decentralization and regionalization of state service. In most African countries, particularly in Central African Republic, the entire state administration is concentrated in the political capital. This often creates a rural exodus. The rural population, especially young people, is forced to leave in mass for the city, motivated by the search for work or better living conditions. The state must be present with all of these instruments and thus create conditions in rural areas that allow for their development. Equitable distribution of goods and wealth. Integration and consideration of minority and vulnerable groups. Radical and extremism groups are also the result of the rejection and exclusion of this category. A standing campaign focused on combating hate speech and incitement to violence. The state must provide greater opportunity and freedom to national and international NGOs to carry out this campaign at all levels and its all region. About how to counter extremist discourses at the religious level, Religious education must be promoted, focusing on a critical and contextual interpretation of a religion text. This will help reduce adherence to extremist interpretation. I think that also interfaith dialogue must be strengthened. Develop meetings and dialogue between religious communities to deconstruct prejudice, strengthen peaceful coexistence, and demonstrate how religion often share commonly held values. Interfaith dialogue also allows religion leaders to speak out publicly against extremism and radical discourses. Thank you very much for attention.
Thank you, Boris. Now I will leave the floor to Tim. Tim, I was making a comment here that probably you couldn't hear. As you know, we had a power cut in Spain and Portugal this Monday, and actually the Zoom platform only came into full work by the afternoon yesterday. So for this kind of events, our communication strategy is we have this in our webpage from more than a week ago, but then we start 2 days before to spread the information. So it was completely boycotted by the event. But anyway, you have in front of you, these are my students. These students are the students of Sub-Saharan Africa, of the lecture of Sub-Saharan Africa. And we were actually, we were just to enter this part of the program that you are entering in this moment. So these people is, let's say, younger, not some of them are not so young, but most are, that are set to listen to you. So this is not, let's say, a casual group of people. Unfortunately, we could not gather the others, but it was not, let's say, the fault is with the devil, not with God. Thank you, Tim, for being with us. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much for having me. And I just checked online, there's already 3 people watching the live stream. So I think maybe if this is the General Secretary of the United Nations and two other presidents, then maybe we will have a big impact nevertheless. But as you said, I'm always happy also to talk to students because yes, this is the future, and to shape and give some ideas early on how we can see the world. So thank you very much for having me, and also thank you for keeping a focus on the Central African Republic. The conflict is not resolved, especially as a spectator who has been covering the conflict for more than a decade now. I worry it could escalate also again. It might not. It's always hard to predict conflicts, but it has all the ingredients for a new escalation. So turning our gaze away from the country would be very problematic. First and foremost for the people on the ground, but also for those who want to maybe build peace. And here I would also like to mention that the Portuguese contingent in the United Nations and their contribution to the European Union training mission in the Central African Republic, and maybe Professor can agree or contradict me here, the Portuguese have a very good reputation in the country. And to give one anecdote, in 2017, there was a horrible attack on the town of Bangassou, and over 100 people were killed. And the contingent on the ground, which was from another country, did not do their job very well. And it was only until the rapid intervention battalion from the Portuguese arrived as quickly as they could, that they stopped the fighting, and that is still very positively remembered. So I think also for the students and for the Portuguese public, I think it's important to know that the investment of military, of resources, but also of potential lives that the Portuguese are ready to do within peace building are appreciated on the ground and are also recognized by researchers as myself that are studying this. Now, nevertheless, that's not what I'm talking about. We're talking about interreligious dialogue encountering violent extremism. And we have the great opportunity today that, although I agree with many things the Professor Yakubu just said, I want to disagree on the core premise. And I think that will make for an interesting discussion. And that is, I want to say this is not a religious war. So let me take the title of the seminar, which is Interreligious Dialogue Encountering Violent Extremism. So let's take this violent extremism. The last part, the Central African Republic has seen a lot of violence. That is without doubt. Now the question is it extremism? And extremism, first of all, here we haven't put any adjective yet to what kind of extremism, but extremism is defined as having some kind of ideological background and aim. You can have right-wing extremists that wants to destroy democracy and install an authoritarian, maybe fascist state. You can have religious extremism, where a certain group wants to, install their doctrine, their way of seeing how world and the beyond world works on the entirety of the society. And I do not see such extremist tendencies in the Central African Republic, especially thinking that I'm also a comparative scholar. So, for instance, in Somalia, or what you see with Boko Haram, or with other groups, maybe in the Sahel, that clearly have religiously extremist agendas. Those I did clearly not see, for instance, with the Seleka. So I would disagree with this point with Professor Yakubu. I do not think they had an extremist agenda. They had a very violent, that is without doubt, but I don't think they had a doctrinal extremist agenda with this violence. So then, of course, if the premise is put into question, is this violent extremism? Then the question also arises, what about interreligious dialogue, encountering it? Now, let's take religious dialogue first. And here I want to agree very strongly with what Professor Yakubu said, that in the Central African Republic, religious actors can have a strong impact in mobilizing for violence or mobilizing against violence. It's one of the institutions that works very well as a mobilizing factor of bringing larger groups together at least once a week, and having discourses about how you should live together. And this is being used to religious dialogue, religious messages are being used by multiple actors in very courageous manners also to tell the people that are willing to listen to them, for instance, during a Sunday Mass or during daily prayers at the mosque, to step down from violence, to live peacefully together, even if that may go against some violent actors. So that there are some very courageous messages from religious actors. But there's also the opposite. There are also religious actors that are instilling hatred, that are using their congregations or even messages on social media and on radio media to instill hate against those that do not agree with their religious interpretation of the world. So I do not know of a study that has, taken the pros and the cons of religious messaging in the Central African Republic and weighing whether overall this has rather a positive or rather a negative aspect. But clearly it goes in both directions. And we shouldn't forget that, of course, religious messaging itself is a form of othering, and especially religious messaging that is strong, that is repetitive, that creates institutions and belonging, also creates at the same time those that belong not, which is in the Central African Republic, I will get back to it, a very important aspect. Now we're talking of inter-religious dialogue. So not each, priest or imam talking to their congregations, but the priest and the imam and the archevêque and from different denominations talking with one another. Now, this suggests, of course, that at the heart of the conflict is a conflict between these different congregations. Because otherwise, why do you need them to talk with one another? But this is not originally the case. It is more about belonging and exclusion in the Central African Republic. And here there happens to be an overlap of those groups that have been the most excluded in the Central African Republic with the religious dimension. The groups that have been most excluded from participating in the state, from being recognized as citizens that belong in the country, or the Fulani, so nomadic herders, or Mbororo, or Pearl, as they're called in different areas, and those that have so-called Arab roots, so stemming from Chad or Sudan many generations ago. And these two groups are predominantly Muslim, but not all of them. There are also some that are Christian or animist or don't practice. But they have been very excluded from participating in society. And the origins of the Seleka rebellion also stem from this exclusion in society, mixed with very opportunist goals of certain armed groups that, were being hindered from exploiting diamonds, gold, the population, and then bounded together against the president for opportunist reasons. But it is not for religious reasons. That is very important to keep in mind. So then when you bring together religious leaders and they propose interreligious or they dialogue interreligiously to propose solutions, sometimes this can fuel the narrative that this is indeed a religious conflict because we have religious leaders that have to solve it. And it also, intriguingly, brings in doctrinal questions that were not there before. So, for instance, in observing peace mediation committees in Obo, in Bangassou, in Pawa, in Bambari, in other places, one thing the Catholic members, for instance, would propose is a very Catholic idea, namely that of forgiveness, even after you have clearly been done wrong. So the one example that I saw in Bangassou was a Muslim trader had their motorbike stolen. Well, the interfaith committee didn't have any enforcement power and the motorbike was gone. So what they proposed, especially the Catholic members, was you need to forgive the person, the thief, and the community from which that thief stems for stealing the motorbike. And that is a religious doctrine of how such things should be taken care of. But that actually led then to the Muslim members of the interfaith committee to leave the committee because they had the feeling that this interfaith committee was justifying and covering violence and abuse. So intriguingly, by wanting to do something good, you bring in doctrinal questions, the Catholic idea of forgiveness. And you also bring in doctrinal questions because whereas for the Catholic representatives, as a very hierarchical religious institution, it's quite clear who should represent this community. If you go to the Protestant community, all of a sudden you have many different churches. If you go to the Muslim community, all of a sudden you have very many different nominations of who should be representing, and even the Muslim faith is per se meant to be less hierarchic than others. So all of a sudden you bring in representational issues that also are doctrinal. And often it is then the very modest, progressive imam, for instance, that is taken in, but then maybe is not seen as very representative of the whole spectrum of Muslim society. So it raises questions of who is the doctrinal adequate person to represent our faith. Now, the last word that I would like to discuss from the title is countering. So, can these interreligious dialogues counter violent extremism? Well, first of all, interreligious fora can attract funding. unfortunately, it speaks to a very problematic narrative of that of so-called terrorists being linked to Islam, and also then the opposite, that somehow interreligious dialogue can be the solution. Unfortunately, this narrative stems from 9/11, and that's 25 years ago. And it's a Western perception that somehow the Muslim religion is connected to a violent way of enacting politics, and that as Christians, somehow the interreligious dialogue is something that could appease this violence that emanates from potential Muslim perpetrators. And that is, of course, a very problematic way of seeing the world. And I would very strongly encourage also the students in this room that the conflicts that are typically seen as being religious, to just try not to see them as religious. I think Somalia, for instance, if you see the conflict there as not religiously based, it can help us much better understand what is happening with Al-Shabaab and other groups than if we always see this as a religious conflict. The same in the Sahel, the same in Nigeria. Of course, religion plays a role, but this dominant narrative that has been created after 9/11 is very problematic, and it leads to statements I've had in the Central African Republic. People talk to me, oh, we're very worried that Boko Haram might come soon and join the Seleka Alliance. Boko Haram has never come to the Central African Republic, and it will never come to the Central African Republic. But these kinds of narratives stick because it seems like it's an interreligious conflict, and that quickly raises these images of the Muslim terrorist that are just not at all present in the Central African Republic. But there are, of course, very real acts of mediation by these boards. And I think that's important to see. I mean, mediation boards, peace mediation boards in the Central African Republic do very courageous work, and they're very important to local society. However, I would suggest not seeing them as interreligious boards, but seeing them as communal boards. And I also want to take away the intercommunal, because that suggests again that the violence is between strong groups. No, it is the community itself has overlapping identities, and the community needs to build itself. But when we have this inter in it, we actually create and reproduce fissures that are very problematic. So since in the Central African Republic, a key part is the exclusion of certain groups from political power, for instance, and that often overlaps by coincidence between Christian and animist groups having power and Muslim Arab groups not having political power. Now, for instance, if we take the Catholic Church as a key moderating institution into many things that are happening in the Central African Republic, we reinforce this divide, because the Catholic Church is clearly one of the best organized institutions in the Central African Republic. So during the elections, they were key to organizing voting. But again, this of course reinforced this institution that is already a dominant institution. And when violence emanated, the one area that Muslim refugees could often seek refuge was again at the Catholic compounds. Now, that didn't necessarily lead to more interreligious understanding, but rather to even more frustration, to asking, why is the Catholic institution, this very strong institution that is the only to be able to provide the service of seeking, of creating a refugee camp, of providing protection. And that would also, I would say, when the Seleka pillaged many of the churches during their violence, it's often also because that is where many cars were. You know, the Catholic Church was the most wealthy institution in many areas. And then I wonder if it's the religious targeting or if it's rather an opportunistic targeting. So we have to be careful not to reinforce these exclusions. But if we think of it as communal peace committees, then it becomes more interesting. So for instance, in Power, the peace committee worked quite well for a while because the so-called Islam representative was at the same time a former rebel leader. So actually, he didn't so much make use of his religious identity, but rather as his communal standing within certain rebel groups that then believed him, that when he said you have to step down, the UN will provide for safety if you stop thinking you need to protect your community. And then you had the youth representative and you had the women's representative. And if you have all of these different people that kind of bring together the community, I think it's much stronger than having the interfaith community boards that that suggests that there's a religious conflict. Now, the problem is these boards are nowadays being captured by the state. So the state usually is heading the peace committees on the ground. But as Professor Jacobo has very rightly said, one of the core things that will stop violence and conflict in the Central African Republic is good governance. Now, unfortunately, the state is not providing good governance. So the communities need boards, meeting grounds, dialogue forums where they can talk to one another without being captured by the state and reflect how they can demand accountability also from the state to provide good governance, schooling, health, infrastructure, without having the risk that these boards are now just captured by the state and are used as intelligence fora, give us the information so that the state can do what is best for it, but maybe not best for the population. So I thank you very much for that and give the floor back to you.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks for being helping us to polemize a little the discussion. It is always, for us academics, it's also always the best thing that we like to do. Anyway, before you can put your questions, comments, etc. in Portuguese if you want. I will help you translate. Okay? If you want to put it directly in English, you are very welcome. Okay? And even if any one of you wants to put a question to Boris, and if you know French, you can put it in French. No problem. Does anybody speak French here? You see, in Portugal, we used to, our first foreign language used to be the French until the 60s. And then the world changed, and Portugal also. Anyway, you can put your questions in English or in Portuguese. Before that, I would like to ask to Boris and to Agustin whether you should like to react to some of the questions that have been put by Tim. Yes.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, everyone, once more for being here and for your interest in the case of the Central African Republic. I very much agree with what Tim was saying in terms of the conflict dynamic in Central African Republic not being one based on religious ideology. So this is I think there was maybe a little bit of difficulties or lost in translation because Boris's language is French and some of the elements of the presentation might not have come across fully. But indeed, this was a political military coup that took place in 2013 with Jotodia coming in with fighters from neighboring countries. They're majority Muslim countries and therefore of Muslim religious identity that came down and then did all this damage to the majority Christian population, which then resulted, as Boris was explaining, in the creation of these anti-Balaka groups, and therefore the conflict taking on a religious identity element, which was capitalized on by the political and power interests there in the country. So I think in that sense, Tim, I think we're on the same page in terms of the understanding of it being a case in which religious identity has been manipulated in order to justify violence. And one thing I wanted to also talk about a little bit about, I very much also see the point that Tim is mentioning about how the solution that is found, one being of inter-religious dialogue, has the potential to then entrench further the divide between those respective faith communities. But one thing so CAICID as an organization has been supporting, giving technical and operational support to the Plateforme de Confession Religieuse Centrafricaine, which is the main interfaith platform, interreligious platform that was created shortly after the conflict broke out by the initiative of Cardinal Zapalinga, who's the head of the Catholic Church in CAR, and Imam Layama, who's the head of the Central African Islamic Committee at the time. And also on board to that platform, interreligious platform, came Pastor Nicolas Kedekuyama, who was the president of the Christian Protestant community. And it is this three-part coalition of the main religious communities represented in the country that became the PCRC, this interfaith platform with a secretariat in Bangui, and then these interfaith antenna offices in the 16 prefectures, or back then 16 prefectures located across the country. And Tim was also talking about the local peace and reconciliation committees. These are mandated by the Ministry of National Reconciliation, and sort of the direct implementation of some of the recommendations that came from the Bangui National Forum from 2015, which was to create a flourishing, or try to create a flourishing civil society that was able to address and mediate conflict at the local level. And it's true, what Tim was talking about, that some of these committees are then, that there's issues of representation, because in fact, it ends up being the ministry that's putting their selected people in these committees, and so they end up lacking this organic nature to them. And again, the people that are placed in those committees are not really representative of the communities they're supposed to be speaking on behalf of. So there are many issues. It's a very complex dynamic, because there are, the Triple R group, for example, that I think Boris mentioned in his presentation as well, or maybe if he didn't mention them, they're one of the 14, I think up to 14 now, different armed groups that are there exploiting the country for its natural resources. And this group, the Triple R, comes from Cameroon. So really, they're just using the chaos in the current situation, CR, to profit, and there is no grand political ideology attached to the Triple R as a movement. They're just there to exploit natural resources, and that's very much the case with, generally speaking, with all the armed groups that are there. Boris was talking about one of them in particular, that headed by Ali Daras, who's was attempting, in fact, a cessation of the northwest of the country. That has not happened so far. But generally speaking, these groups, whether they're majority, they used to be majority Seleka, but now they've mixed up. So you have Seleka fighters collaborating with Anti-Balaka. That are forming these new alliances between the different armed groups to see how they can better exploit the resources in the land. So this very much so is no longer, it never was really a conflict between religious identity, nor religiously motivated conflict, but one of purely political, military, and economic interest. And CAICID as an organization, one of the main things that we've been doing is providing both technical and operational support to the interfaith platform, formed by these three main religious leaders, and then at the community level, again represented by the priest, the pastor, and the imam. And just to give you one story, and to highlight the importance, in fact, of religious identity for the people that are at least involved in trying to mediate on the ground. I remember I was meeting Pastor Nicolas Kedekuyama at 10 a.m. In the morning at his office in Bangui, and he took my meeting. It was 10 o'clock. We got into his office. Boris was with me. His phone kept on ringing nonstop. And the pastor apologized and said, "I'm sorry, my phone is really busy because this morning they'd killed my brother and my nephew." just this morning, a couple hours ago. I think it might have been in Bangassou, if I remember correctly. The point is that the pastor still took my meeting at 10 a.m. and told me, Agustin, the reason I'm not picking up the phone is because right now I have a really hot head and I'm really injured emotionally and spiritually, and I do not feel like I'm okay for taking calls because I don't want to be manipulated, because I know that these calls are coming in to get me to take one stand or another given the current conflict. So in that sense, what I want to highlight there is that from my perspective, it really is the sort of his religious faith and conviction that is guiding him and giving him support in that situation, where he's able to take the strength not to go and react or overreact to the death of his younger brother and his nephew, and actually take his role as a community leader, a religious community leader, put that first and do what's best for his community. That's one of the several stories that are taking place in CER that highlight the kind of the importance of religious leaders in pacifying and supporting the pacification efforts of the country. They've been witness and signatories, Cardinal Zapalinga, Pastor Gakuyama, and Imam Layama, to I believe every major peace accord that has been signed since 2013. Another story that I mentioned actually during the previous seminar that we did in Praga, just again to highlight once more the kind of influence and power that religious leaders have in context of conflict, given the trust and the access that they have by their communities. The late Pope Francis, he actually did a tour of Africa in 2015, and one of the countries he visited was Central African Republic. Boris spoke before about the neighborhood PK5 that was taken over by armed groups. This is a neighborhood, I've been there several times. One of our main counterparts there is Imam Tijani, who's the head of the main mosque in PK5. This is a neighborhood that gets close to traffic. UN is not allowed in, depending on the situation. And in fact, they have these different armed groups controlling the neighborhood. Pope Francis, against all the advice of the French that were doing most of the security at the time, the MINUSCA, the Vatican, they said, don't go to PK5 to pray with the Imam. He wanted to go to meet the Imam in PK5, go to the mosque, and do a joint prayer with the Imam Tijani. And against all the advice, saying, we cannot guarantee your protection. This is a very bad idea. There's armed groups controlling the neighborhood. There's no way we can actually physically protect you. The Pope insisted, met with Imam Tijani, had his joint prayer, and then spontaneously, PK5, which is a majority Muslim neighborhood, they all followed the Pope to the football stadium to be received by the majority Christian population. And mind you, this is a time when if you're Muslim and you leave PK5, you're likely to get macheted to death. There's no freedom of movement. You can't leave that neighborhood. This story made the news rounds in around 2015, but it again highlights these are Muslims following the Pope. It took someone like Pope Francis to be able to have that happen. So at least temporarily, it opened up opportunity for dialogue and opened up opportunity for healing and reconciliation. And that's the kind of power and influence that religious leaders have in these kinds of contexts. I don't think anybody but the Pope could have managed to do that. And this was actually retold to me by a Rwandan peacekeeper when I was in Bangui, and tears were coming down his face, telling me the story because from his perspective, he witnessed a miracle. He had been there, seen what the situation in PK5 was like, and could not believe what his eyes saw when the Muslim neighborhood actually followed the Pope into the stadium to be received by the Christian community. So I'll leave it here for now. Just wanted to give you a little bit of context and get you a little bit closer to the reality of what happens in CAR. Thank you.
Boris, do you want to say something now?
I want just to think about the several groups and to distinct the extremism in politics and extremism in religion. We speak about instrumentalization of the religion. And in Central African Republic, all this group, anti-Balaka, PK5, self-defense, and the Seleka are the extremists in religion because they use the name of religion to justify their violence. It's not the same thing in the world. Today, this group, anti-Balaka and others, don't exist because their revendication is not are not values today. So, peut-être que je vais m'exprimer en français et tu vas traduire. Je veux exprimer le fait que nous devons regarder, par exemple, au niveau du Cameroun, et il y a des extrémistes, mais qui sont des extrémistes politiques, par exemple, dans le nord-est du Cameroun, ils revendiquent quelque chose qui n'a rien à voir avec la question de la religion. Et en Afrique, oui.
Yeah, versus just making reference to the group that I mentioned before in Cameroon, the Triple R, which is just a political movement.
Et de manière générale, en Afrique, nous distinguons ces deux groupes, des extrémistes en politique et des extrémistes en religion.
In the African context, they usually make a distinction between political extremism and religious extremism.
Et si nous voulons aujourd'hui combattre l'instrumentalisation de la religion par des violences, il est important de considérer ces deux groupes extrémistes.
And today we try and counter the manipulation of religion to justify violence and also how to deal with these politically extreme groups.
Et c'est comme ça qu'en Afrique, nous allons voir que ces groupes-là se confondent. En Centrafrique, par exemple, ces extrémistes sont au niveau de la religion, mais après, ils sont transformés en politique.
And so in the case of Central African Republic, we did have religious extremists that then turned into political extremists.
Donc la question est, qui utilise le nom de la religion pour justifier la violence?
So the question is, who is using the name of religion to justify violence?
Et quand nous faisons une bonne distinction des personnes qui utilisent le nom de la religion pour la violence, ça nous permet de combattre l'extrémisme violent à tous les niveaux.
And so when we make a clear analysis of who is using religion to justify violence, we're able to address the issue at its core. Thank you.
Okay, now we will open, but Tim, if you feel you want to talk, or also those that are with us online, they can no. Let me see, because we have still Zoom problems. Because no, it's okay. So if anybody here wants to raise a question, please. Se alguém aqui quiser levantar uma questão, não me deixem ficar mal, vocês têm que falar. Se vocês não falarem, eu tiro aquelas notas todas que vos dei. Yes, please.
Só um bocadinho. Fica gravado.
Say your name, please.
Hello, good morning. My name is Paulo. I could speak in English or in French. My English is not very good. My French is also not very good, but I think the people could understand. I came a little bit late. I'm geographer, but sometimes I can find the way to get faster in the place I want to be. And I don't listen what you telling today about the religion, but I believe in God. I believe in God. And I think that religion are a kind of geography, that the prophets, they were born in some place, in geography place and historic place, and they give message to the people to have a good love between all the people. And of course, Papa Francisco do a very good work in that kind of try to have a good relationship with all the religions. I think that is the way for the planet moves, because I think love and respect is one kind of language that all the religions of the people that believe in God, they have it. Do you think in the few decades we can have more connections, or maybe another religion, or the people try to have in the old countries a study between the connections between philosophy and religion? I think that is a good way for all the schools in the world. They have, I think it's a good way to the people understand. The other ones is we have connections and we have respect for all the religions, and that is only by knowledge and education between all the religions and many philosophies could be a way that people one day they could have another kind of prophet that coming to the planet Earth to have some kind of connections around the world, because we live in globalization and the internet and the social media. We have more possibility to understand how the things happens. In Africa, some places is more difficult, but that is the work of the African people, or some parts of the world, they don't have so much connections between the internet and in the social media or schools or universities, whatever. I think I don't know if you understand the question.
Yes, Pedro. Yes, Pedro. You put a prophetic question. Yes. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Pedro. Before you answer, I would ask whether there are some other. Let's collect three questions.
Morning, everybody. Thank you for the presentation and the intervention. Professor Jacobo, you spoke about the Seleka and Antimbalaka conflict, but the last conflict in your country was 2020, 2021, during the election. In my opinion, the religions component was not present in that time. But the future worries me. Like Professor Tim said, we have boots on the ground. That's the reason is my question. In your opinion, what is the influence of the radical groups in the north of your country? Because we know what's happened in PK5, we know what's happened in Bangui, but what's happened in the north of the country, because we have in the border some countries who the religions is the Islamic. Okay, thank you.
My question is directed to Tim, as my colleagues, I'll have the chance to, in case, ask question later. And you touch upon a very, I'm really interested in seeing your perspective on this issue. You touch upon the very crucial question of also the relations between the various religions, with Catholicism being more institutionalized, having a stronger institution. And we've seen also Catholic institutions being important players in the Central African Republic, the community of Sant'Egidio most of all, facilitating a lot of the peace agreements. Considering that most of the actors that instead back the government, from European countries to currently the more Russian-backed groups, have a clear money-grabbing, power-grabbing intention, do you see maybe, and these are big institutions backed maybe by states or by a lot of funds, in this more larger geopolitical context, do you see as the Catholic institution is actually trying to play a counterbalancing role, because going only with the community level against majorly backed powers like the Wagner Group or even interest group from France or the Gulf, let's say, as having a different role, like Isru is a Catholic backed, but gives power to community and a message that is mainly of peace, the one of religions. I'm just really interested in seeing your perspective also at the higher level of the relationship between the Catholic institutions and the other player we have in the country that are not so, they don't have any, let's say, beside their selfish gains, they don't aim for anything else than that. Thank you very much.
Okay, let's move around in a different way now. I will give first the floor to Tim, please, Tim.
Yes, thank you very much. I think only the last question was addressed to me, so I will answer that. I think here's the importance to differentiate between interreligious roles and religious roles. And I think the Catholic Church as an institution is playing very many, very important roles. They have very good schools, some of the best schools in the country, across the country, are Catholic-run schools. During the elections would not have been possible without the Catholic Church. If you want to support grassroots NGO work, the Catholic Church has the strongest network across the country, where many other NGOs after the conflict in 2013-14 came into the country with a lot of external funding, but had to build a network first and still have not really achieved it. The Catholic Church has churches almost all over the country and even try to have smaller installations in the more Muslim-dominated areas. So all of a sudden, if you fund Caritas or other Catholic Church-related NGOs, you can very quickly have a local, community-based influence. And I personally also have benefited from that often because, for instance, in some of the very remote areas I went, the only place I could spend the night was in the Catholic guest house. So it has many functions and positive functions that it is playing, and many Catholic priests and higher ranking évêques are playing very positive roles in spreading the message of peace. Now, the problem is, if a conflict is due to inequality, giving more to somebody and that person already being wealthy, you're creating more problems, The Catholic Church is doing very many good things, but the conflict in the Central African Republic is also about exclusion and neglect. So one thing, for instance, that I very forcefully fight for amongst donors is that they do not fund projects that are only based in the capital. It might make sense, What's the problem with building a school in the capital? That's good, More kids can then go to school. But if you build more and more schools in the capital, in comparison, the rural areas where all the rebellions in the Central African Republic have started become even more neglected. Already, the capital has maybe 20% of the population maximum, and it has like 50 to 60 to 70% of all secondary schools. So if you're building another high school in the capital, you're furthering this problem. And the same is with the Catholic institution. And I'm sorry, I must say the same. I would like to ask maybe this also to Augustin and to Professor Yakubu. The interfaith boards, all of them that I have seen, were hosted by the Catholic Church. And the funding that they received was organized, received by, and distributed by the Catholic Church, because it was the only very well institutionalized actor that was able to get foreign funding. And then you have the Protestant priests, and like Augustin mentioned, often you pick one. But there's 12 denominations, there's just one Catholic denomination. But then you pick one priest and you pick one imam, even though there's 3 or 4 different confessions on the ground. So you're creating an imbalance where you reinforce the dominance of the Catholic Church as an institution. Here, I'm not talking about religion, I'm talking as an institution. And that is a problem. Even though what they're doing is mostly positive, it's a problem that we're reinforcing inequalities in the country. Because, and this again from my interviews, focus groups, for instance, with Muslim members of communities, they see this very problematic. They see this as a big problem that the Catholic Church has so much influence and that Catholic and Protestant actors have all the power. So even though you want to do something good, you're reinforcing this exclusion of Arab origin, mostly Muslim communities in the Central African Republic.
Thank you. Now I give you the floor, Boris.
Je voudrais demander le fait que qui sont les groupes extrémistes en fait?
And he's posing the question, who are the extremist groups, in fact?
Je disais tout à l'heure que les groupes extrémistes sont créés par... ce sont des personnes qui sont des minorités.
He was mentioning that before that the extreme groups are created by people that are the minority.
Ce sont des personnes qui sont dans des zones isolées dans une région et qui se sentent lésées parce qu'ils ne profitent pas de la juste répartition des biens.
They are in marginalized regions and they feel neglected because they not benefit from the services of the state.
Ou encore, ce sont des groupes qui n'arrivent pas à exprimer leur identité, que ce soit ethnique, religieuse ou politique.
There are also groups that don't manage to express or see their identity recognized, whether it's religious, ethnic, or political.
À mon avis, en Afrique, par exemple, nous allons connaître encore la résurgence ou le regain de ces différents groupes.
In Africa, we've considered
la résurgence de ces différents groupes.
The resurgence of this phenomenon.
Et pour revenir sur la question, en Centrafrique, par exemple, les violences des élections en 2020 et puis encore dans les élections qui vont venir.
So to take it to the question before about the violence that happened during the elections in 2020 and also the potential violence that's coming with the new elections,
peuvent être expliquées par le fait que en 2014, je l'avais dit, tous ces groupes extrémistes se sont retirés dans le nord du pays.
This can potentially have its source in the fact that, as was explained before, that a lot of these, ex-Seleka groups retired by moving to the north.
Aujourd'hui, à Bangui, au niveau de la capitale, il n'y a plus de Seleka, il n'y a plus de anti-Balaka, il n'y a plus de anti-défense de PK5.
Today in Bangui, we don't have any more anti-Balaka, Seleka, or self-defense units from PK5.
Mais c'est parce que leurs revendications n'ont plus de droit et ces différents groupes se sont transformés d'extrémisme religieux en extrémisme politique.
Because these groups have then transformed themselves from religious extremism to political extremism.
Alors, on peut expliquer alors les violences pendant les élections par le fait que ces différents groupes se sont retirés dans le nord et ils se sentent toujours lésés. Ils pensent qu'ils sont marginalisés, qu'ils ne profitent pas des biens de la République.
So the violence emerging in the north in 2020 elections can be explained by this phenomenon where the ex-Seleka groups that were marginalized have migrated up north.
Je disais tout à l'heure que pour combattre l'extrémisme violent, l'une des solutions est la bonne gouvernance.
One of the solutions I mentioned before to combat violent extremism is good governance.
Et c'est de cette manière que ces différents groupes peuvent se considérer comme des Centrafricains et ils auront la joie de se sentir appartenir au Centrafrique.
And the issue or the aim is to get these people that were feeling marginalized to actually feel like they are citizens of Central African Republic.
Il y a des programmes de démobilisation et la réinsertion des groupes armés qui est mis en place.
We have a program, DDR program of demobilization and reintegration of those that are ex-fighters to reintegrate back into being productive members of society.
Mais ce programme ne marche pas. C'est resté politique et ces groupes se considèrent toujours comme des marginalisés.
But the program is not really working effectively, and the group continues to feel like they're marginalized.
Donc, nous devons faire attention et voir dans quelle mesure, à travers les différentes campagnes de sensibilisation, exiger donc la bonne gouvernance et amener les pouvoirs en place à considérer, à introduire ces différents groupes dans les systèmes pour éviter les violences pendant les élections.
So we have to use different advocacy and sensibilization tactics to make sure that these people are, and effective DDR programs to ensure that these people are reintegrated prior to the next elections, or integrated as much as possible.
Si le gouvernement ne fait pas cette politique-là, l'instrumentalisation de la religion pour justifier les violences va toujours continuer. Et ça sera toujours la même chose aussi, non seulement en Centrafrique, mais on vivra la même chose dans la plupart des pays en Afrique.
If these processes are not done effectively, the instrumentalization of religion to justify violence will continue, not just in CAR, but in other African countries.
Et sur un autre aspect, je voudrais revenir un peu sur la question du vivre ensemble dans l'avenir, dans le futur.
I wanted to talk a little bit about living together in the future.
Notre ami ici parlait de la combinaison, la complémentarité de la philosophie et de la religion pour permettre à l'avenir un meilleur vivre ensemble.
The questioner before was talking about merging philosophy with religion in order to gain a better understanding.
Je suis totalement d'accord avec lui dans la mesure où il va être enseigné les principes de la vie en société. Et c'est de cette manière que nous pouvons promouvoir le vivre ensemble.
I agree that this kind of teaching is necessary in order to encourage social coexistence.
Nous n'avons pas le monde, la société, tant que les gens vont vivre ensemble, nous savons qu'il y aura toujours les violences. Mais nous sommes appelés à vivre ensemble. Et dès lors, nous devons développer justement ces stratégies de vivre ensemble à travers la tolérance, à travers l'acceptation de l'autre, à travers l'acceptation de la différence. C'est comme ça que nous pouvons vivre ensemble dans ce monde.
We have no choice but to learn how to live together, and therefore strategies or educational strategies that highlight tolerance and understanding of the other, and better, we could say, even in the context of religion, religious literacy are what is needed in order to ensure a peaceful coexistence in the future.
Thank you.
Let's go. Just comment on one of the.
You want?
Yes, just to add a little extra there, in terms of so to highlight again, to mention again the point of representation, and it's a very tricky issue because, as he was mentioning, it's the Catholic Church that is actually best organized, and to be an imam, the person who has best, who's most knowledgeable about the Quran within that given neighborhood or prefecture is the one who gets to lead the prayer. And so there's no necessarily formal training accompanied to it. There's no real organizational structure backing that up. And so, one of the things actually before starting our work in CAR, one of the dynamics that was existing there, because the Seleka fighters were coming from northern countries, so Chad, South Sudan, they were considered then by the autochthonous, the indigenous Muslim community also as quote unquote foreign Muslims. So there was not only an inter-religious divide, or one sort of along the lines of Christian versus Muslim, but also within the Islamic community, there was also an internal divide between Muslims. That was also political in the sense that Imam Layama, who I mentioned was one of the founders of the platform, had been the president of the Central African Islamic Committee for too long. So he passed his mandate, his legal mandate. And the excuse there was that there was a crisis and that it was not time to call for elections. But anyway, this also caused some division within the Muslim community, but that division, again, was sort of partitioned between those autochthonous Muslims that were backed up by Imam Layama and those foreign Muslims that were, in a sense, the opposition that was then looking to get hold of the presidency of the Islamic community. But this is to say that these questions of representation and division are constantly there and shifting as well, because alliances shift and the dynamics change. But it's something that we try to adapt to as much as possible, as quickly as possible, given that in a situation of conflict, dynamics are shifting constantly. But just wanted to highlight that point that, Casey, when we came in, our main entry point was Muslim intra-religious dialogue, to then strengthen that community to be together in order to better dialogue with the larger Christian community. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to a last round of questions. So I ask you 3 more questions. Yes, but let's privilege those that have not yet spoken, but I will give you the floor if you want. Cristina, do you have any question? Yes.
Thank you for all this updated information on these questions. As a journalist, I always have the question, what chances do these people who we have been referring as the communities have to choose or to trust any of these programs of that try to bring them together and give them, well, as a journalist, I'm always concerned with the aftermath of extreme violent episodes, people who lose their houses, where they are located afterwards, the growing of refugee camps and so on. And they suffer several and continuous episodes such as this. What are their chances to follow any suggestion of bringing them together? What kind of you've mentioned representation, which is very important. How do they, in the base, get to organize in order to follow or to accept whatever is suggested to them? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to overstep a little bit also. It's the first time I've been in the 4 seminars we did, so I have the benefit of learning about these things. I was we talked about Nigeria in Coimbra, Mozambique in Évora, and Ethiopia in Braga, and now here in Lisbon. And there are some cross-cutting points that I take from each seminar that maybe, and that you already talked about here today. Religious extremism, religion is used as a tool for political power most of the time. Although there is religious extremism, that's very clear. In most cases, either in elections, either in regional conflicts, either within those religion conflicts within certain communities, religion is just a pretext to gather more power most of the time. We had a very strong, a very powerful testimony when we made the seminar about Nigeria from a priest that was kidnapped, and that saw that the kidnappers were doing things that were totally against the religion they supposedly followed. They drank, they smoked, they well, all kinds of extreme things. So they do not follow the principles of the religion they supposedly are championing. So it's very difficult to fight these groups because it's very easy for them in remote areas of the countries to show that joining them, people will probably have a better life. And most of the times, if they don't join, they are killed. So not it's an easy choice, a hard choice, but an easy choice. So this case of and social media, by the way, in every country, mostly in Africa, of course, there are different realities, but everyone has a phone. For example, in Mozambique, when we had this political crisis, most of the more relevant and reliable information was gathered through mobile phones. So everyone has a mobile phone, even in remote, with all the difficulties, but in remote areas. So it's very easy also to use social media. It's not that different from what Trump does, because he also uses religion as a pretext to do some things. It's not that different from what Israel is doing, using religion as a pretext to do atrocities. So religion comes out as an easy instrument to gather and to justify extreme things that don't have to do with religion. Imams we had on these seminars, representatives of other religions, you, Agustin, that was on the field, Professor Tim that was on the field, Professor Cardoso that was on the field in some cases and studies these things, knows that religion is an instrument to gather power, either political power or economical power. For example, in the north of Mozambique, there are economical issues that link to religious extremism that is being done there. So how can we combat this when it's very hard to pass on a message as strong as the one that is using religion for extremism? How can we do this? It's very easy to pick up on negative things and gather someone behind us and to convince someone. But I always feel that a good and positive use and the messages of that religion is based upon that are always positive are not that easy to pass and to have the same effect as the extreme one. So this is more a comment, an overall comment that I'm not an expert, of course, on this, but having the opportunity to have been in the 4 seminars, it's an overview of what I have heard and learned about this issue. Very complicated, very complex, not easy to explain, but and I invite you to look at the other 3 seminars that are on the YouTube channel of Club of Lisbon. You have those testimonies there. You have really powerful examples from different countries that share issues, of course, with different realities, but with same issues that you will learn a lot from them. So sorry for overstepping, but I felt I needed to say something.
Thank you, Pedro. Pedro, of course, you understand, Pedro works with me at the Club of Lisbon. Anyway, a third question. Is there anybody that has not yet spoken that would like to raise the word? If not, I will give you the floor again, please.
Thank you, Professor Cardoso. And this is a question a bit on an aspect that Tim mentioned. It's open, obviously, to Tim and my colleagues too. Tim mentioned briefly one major conflict dynamic, mentioning the Fula, Fulani, Peul, Mbororo with the name. That is a major, if I were a student, I would focus right now my studies on this conflict trend in Africa. That is the nomadic, sedentary, let's say, conflict that from Nigeria, since we touched Nigeria, Mozambique, Kenya, CAR touches upon all the countries. This is like a paradigm clash even bigger than the one between religions, because here we're speaking about sedentary society, this is the one we live in, against nomadic cultures, practices, and tradition. Do you see this conflict dynamic is something that, as in Africa, they're trying to do, in particular in the Central Africa, can be addressed on a nation base, or is inherently and only a question that we can answer to if we look at it in a group, being exactly this group, nomadic, not being really coming from a specific country, but being moving around, being this conflict the major trend in Africa at the moment for conflicts. Is it a problem that CAR can solve on its own, or is something that the international community, the African Union, should really push and focus on? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's give the floor to our two speakers. But if you don't mind, I'd like to raise the issue to more directly to 2 points. The questions are, first one, who is in power in Central African Republic now? This is for you, and for you also. Who is really this government? What this government represents, really? Does he have the support of the people? What part of the population? This is a very political question, but I have to raise it. If you don't want to answer, that's okay. The second point is about foreign intervention in Central African Republic. We know, you know better, that Central African Republic, as many other countries, have a lot of riches, and some of these riches are easily lootable. Okay, they can be easily transported and robbed. And we know that in the Central African Republic, we have neighbors, and you have spoken about Cameroon groups, etc. But I would also like to hear about, we know that besides the United Nations mission, we have mercenary groups that are working with the government, or at least with the knowledge of the government. And interestingly, from different regions, from Russia, from Romania, okay, from other parts that you know better than I. So my point is these 2 points. Who is ruling the country? Okay. And second, what is the role of these foreign groups, not only those that are the countries that are neighboring the Central African Republic, but also that have guns and are inside taking care of mines and things like that. But I will begin with Tim, just to give the opportunity to Boris that is with us to have the last word. Thank you, Tim.
Yes, thank you very much. Big questions. I think with the question of who the government represents, maybe Professor Jacobo knows a little bit better than I, if he can speak on that. But I would also say that the government has limited reach and always has limited reach, had limited reach in the Central African Republic. So it is important to also look at local actors, such as this seminar, also on, for instance, interreligious boards. But who is represented in all kinds of different strata? I like that question because we always forget in every discussion a quarter of the population, or more than a quarter of the population in the Central African Republic. That is the people that are displaced within or outside their country. There still remain about 600,000 people outside their country for now 10 to 12 years. Within the country, about the same number of people. So that is about a quarter of the population. And these people are barely to not at all represented. And the issue of can and how will they return to their communities and maybe take also back control of the market stall they used to have, the house they used to have, etc. is not discussed. And that is a big problem, because you shouldn't ignore a quarter of the population. And here, certainly also religious leaders can, and in certain aspects have played a role in preparing the community for the return and welcome of small, very small groups of people that did return. Then I think the next two questions, if we want to summarize them, like Fernando said, that the second question was about, lootable resources, and maybe religion is also being used as a mobilizing factor to get at these lootable resources. But also the last question about nomadic and sedentary life. I think we have to think of another lens, that is the lootable resources in the Central African Republic from which multiple armed groups are living are, yes, diamonds and gold, but maybe not even predominantly that. It is taxing the movement of cattle herds. So this alleged conflict between sedentary and nomadic is actually false, because the nomads are taxed, I would even say mafia-esque protection scheme wise, by certain armed groups for protection. But they don't want this protection. They basically have to be protected because this armed group exists. Because the sedentary and nomadic cohabitation also has very many benefits. I mean, I talk to communities that, since the nomadic communities don't dare come there anymore because of Anti-Balaka, for instance, they don't have meat on the table anymore. Or if they do, it's become very expensive. And the same for nomads, if they can't so easily go to town anymore to buy, the many things they need from the local population, this creates big problems. So it's not, there's no inherent conflict between the sedentary and nomadic lifestyle. It depends on how it is organized. And when it is organized well by intact community structures, where the things that do happen, unfortunately, like cattle walking through a field, destroying it, eating everything off, for instance, but there are structures everywhere in Africa that deal with these kinds of things. Usually it's the head of the cattle herding group meets the head of the village. They decide on a compensation scheme. It's paid, and it's fine. That's always how it works for decades and in most areas of Africa. But when these structures break down and armed groups say, we are representing you now, no longer the civilian leaders that talk without guns, then that leads to massive escalation. And there, clearly, the state of the Central African Republic could play a positive role in stopping the violent escalation of such conflicts. But unfortunately, it is not. I mean, the way they are acting together with the Wagner militias in stigmatizing certain population groups, of course, leads to the fact that certain population groups, mostly Fulani, but also others, have no trust in this state. So the state, as a neutral arbiter within this relationship that can be very beneficial, but is always, on the razor's edge, because it escalates so easily. When the cattle starts eating the crops off a field, and then the farmer seizes and gets angry and kills the cattle, and then they're like, oh, cattle is like 300,000 sefa, so it's hundreds of dollars. You just destroyed so much of my property. And then they, in violence, maybe kill that person, or at least hurt that person very much in the heat of the moment, and all of a sudden you have an escalation. So of course it's a very delicate situation, but it is not inherently conflictual. And I would like to add one last thing. We're talking about interreligious or interfaith dialogue, and we haven't talked about a very massive phenomenon in the Central Republic, which is animist thought, or let's say non-religious ways of perceiving the spiritual world. And they are very strong in the Central African Republic. Certain armed groups wear amulets that they believe protect them, but not God or somebody else. These are spirits, these are the ancestors for whom they still have a relation. There's huge issues with allegations of witchcraft and sorcery that play a fundamental role in organizing society. And these also link up then to the different faiths differently. Whereas the Catholic interpretation and maybe the more Wahhabi Salafi interpretation of Islam are very strict against these movements and try to stop them. Other Protestant or more Sufist related confessional interpretations are mixing with them much more strongly. So it's also, even though these people are never officially invited to the table, it plays a massive role. And I think we shouldn't forget this. We can say, you know, religion is being abused and manipulated for violent ends, etc. Yes, but we shouldn't take our daily life as a starting point. In the Central African Republic, for instance, religion and spiritual thoughts are absolutely key to everyday life. So you might say, you know, it's not so important, the Catholic Church, but everybody goes every Sunday to church, not every second. And when the priest says something, they listen to it. And when they hear rumors of a witch acting within the community, it motivates them to act. So these things are very, very strong forces in society, and we shouldn't, from a maybe more atheist European background, underestimate the strength religious but also spiritual matters have in mobilizing the people in the Central African Republic.
Thanks, Tim. Now, Boris, you have the last.
Il faut dire que la situation sociopolitique est très complexe en RCA.
We can admit that the socio-political situation in CER is very complex.
Depuis 30 ans, chaque 10 ans, il y a des changements de pouvoir politique qui est accompagné de destruction, de corruption, de la guerre.
During the past 30 years, every 10 years, we've had a political transition that is accompanied with violence and destruction.
Le pays a besoin de stabilité pour se développer. Il faut stabilité politique et économique.
In order to develop, we need some social and political stability.
Le pays regorge de beaucoup de richesses minières.
The country is blessed with lots of natural resources.
Mais il faut compter avec l'influence extérieure de certains pays qui ont besoin de cette richesse et qui viennent influencer grandement.
And we must work to contain the influence of foreign elements that come to exploit the resources.
Au-delà de cette influence internationale, il faut considérer aussi les conflits dans les pays frontaliers. Au Soudan, au Tchad, il y a des groupes armés qui influencent grandement sur le système politique et économique du pays.
We need to also consider the radical elements that exist in northern neighboring countries like Chad and Sudan that also have a lot of influence in destabilizing the country.
Ce qui fait que quand on fait une lecture géopolitique de la République centrafricaine, on verra que le pays vit une complexité, mais le pays a besoin d'une stabilité pour pouvoir se remettre sur le plan politique et économique.
So if we take a general picture of CER, we see that there's a desperate, a very strong need for stability in order to be able to unify the country.
Qui dirige le pays en ce moment?
Who's actually running the country in this moment?
Le pouvoir en place cherche à stabiliser le pays et il est allé chercher on appelle ça de la sécurité chez certains pays extérieurs.
The current government in power, its main objective currently, its priority is to stabilize the country.
Il y a la Russie à travers le groupe Wagner, il y a le Rwanda, il y a beaucoup d'autres pays qui sont là de manière militaire.
There are several actors that are there, the peacekeeping forces from MINUSCA, Wagner, the Rwandese.
le dirigeant du pays les appelle pour protéger son pouvoir, mais malheureusement, ils sont là aussi, ils exploitent la richesse du pays.
So the current government has asked them to support them in stabilizing the country, but the payback is exploitation of the country's resources.
C'est ça le paradoxe. Tu me protèges et je te donne mes richesses.
So that is the trade-off. I protect you and you give me your riches.
Moi, je pense que au-delà de cette complexité, l'influence extérieure doit s'arrêter en fait.
Crucial within this dynamic is to try and stop external influence.
Mais il y a aussi des grains d'expérience, dans la mesure où, par exemple, si on considère au niveau religieux, la majorité de la population se dit croyant.
But if you also consider the religious dimension, the majority of the population considers itself a believer.
Et de cette manière, je pense, et je réitère encore que nous devons développer davantage le dialogue interreligieux.
And in this regard, I want to advocate for the need to continue to develop work in inter-religious dialogue.
Pour garantir les relations intercommunautaires et le vivre ensemble entre les communautés déjà.
To guarantee the living peaceful coexistence amongst the different communities that already live, share the same space.
Au niveau politique, je pense que la RCA n'a pas vraiment besoin des forces comme la MINUSCA, comme les Wagner, comme les autres en ce moment. Parce que ce qui est important pour nous, c'est combattre la pauvreté, donner du travail aux jeunes, amener ceux qui se considèrent comme des groupes isolés, comme des groupes qui sont lésés, à avoir leur part de responsabilité et leur contribution dans la gestion et dans la répartition des biens dans ce pays.
What we really need to focus on is on economic prosperity and economic development. I'm not sure that that we really need MINUSCA or all these foreign influences in the country. We need to prioritize our own national economic development.
Donc voilà, pour moi, je pense qu'il faut l'influence extérieure doit s'arrêter et laisser la possibilité aux fils du pays d'exploiter leurs richesses. Et nous avons besoin aussi de cette stabilité politique. Hein. Quand il y aura toujours la guerre chaque 10 ans, on ne peut pas promouvoir le développement dans un pays.
So we need first and foremost this kind of economic stability to be able to, and general stability to be able to develop and move the country forward.
Et au niveau de la sous-région aussi, les différents conflits à la frontière avec le Tchad, avec les Soudans, les problèmes avec les conflits entre les éleveurs et les agriculteurs, qui sont des conflits au-delà de la RCA, sont des problèmes peut-être que nous ne pourrons pas annihiler totalement, mais au moins la communauté internationale doit regarder à ce moment-là et voir comment est-ce qu'on peut, au niveau interne, au niveau sous-régional, les combattre pour avoir une stabilité sous-régionale.
So a lot of these dynamics, conflict dynamics that we mentioned, including the herders, farmers dynamic, and the others need to be studied in depth by the international community, and they need to support in a way that is actually addressing the issues, the specificity of the issues.
Donc la paix, le vivre ensemble n'est pas pour aujourd'hui, mais c'est possible pour demain.
So today, we currently do not have peace, but we are hopeful that we will be able to achieve it when tomorrow comes.
Inshallah. Agustin, it's up to you to close, please.
Thank you, Fernando. Well, thank you very much once again for coming and for spending time with us here today. And thank you to Club de Lisboa, and thanks very much to Boris for coming all the way from Bangui. It's a long trip. And very much thanks to Tim. I hope we continue the conversation, because you're clearly very many insights into what's happening, not just there, but in the region as well. Just to say that in terms of a key message, and this has been highlighted, I think, by all of us, once you delve deeply or more deeply into what is causing specific conflict, violent conflict, one that has been advertised and pronounced in the media to be an interreligious conflict. The moment you scratch a little bit that surface, you realize that there's many dynamics at play, and that effectively, usually, in most cases, it is religious identity that has been manipulated by the politicians to then justify their political gain and the violence that is done in their name of their particular goal that they're trying to achieve. I encourage you to, as Fernando was saying, check out the CAICID webpage. We've been here in Lisbon now about 2.5 years. We moved our headquarters from Vienna to Lisbon. And we are excited with the possibility of Portugal also joining the organization. The invitation was officially sent to the Minister of Foreign Affairs last year in November. So if everything goes well, hopefully by soon enough, Portugal will also be a member of the organization's Council of Parties. And that will make it to be among Spain, Austria, Saudi Arabia, the Holy Seas, and maybe Portugal. Once that happens, I have my hopes is that we will continue to expand and really become a global organization with global presence, and keep on promoting interreligious and intercultural dialogue to address issues at the local, regional, and global level. So thanks very much once again for your attention.
Caros estudantes, muito obrigado pela vossa disciplina. Não vos agradeço o facto de não terem feito perguntas, exceto eu vi quem é que fez perguntas, portanto os outros vão baixar um valor na nota. Nós terminamos a nossa aula por hoje, portanto não precisam de regressar à aula e até à próxima semana, está bem? Muito obrigado.
Olhem, mas vejam o que está no canal YouTube do Clube de Lisboa sobre os outros países e de certeza que se virem, utilizem as ferramentas de inteligência artificial para resumir os debates, não para fazer os trabalhos, mas para resumir os debates que lá estão, e de certeza que se colocarem lá coisas, conseguem ultrapassar esta nota abaixo que o professor deu.
Eu não lhe pedi este discurso, mas se quiserem usar. Shall we lunch together again? You have a very good restaurant.
That would be nice.
Almoças connosco? Almoças connosco? Vamos escolher aqui o café. 15 minutos. 15 minutos.